Greetings. Welcome to the McAllister House here in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where history lives. I'm so pleased to be able to tell you a very special story about this beautiful flag behind me here. It says Manitowoc County, Wisconsin Volunteers. It means a lot to me because my great-grandfather was one of the boys who walked with this flag, who fought with this flag. And it has an amazing story that I want to share with you. In 1861, there were difficulties between the North and the South. The North was more industrial and had plans for this beautiful land that they were building estates on. And the South, of course, they were more mansions and cotton fields, and they needed slaves to make things happen for them. And freedom was the word that rang in the ears of the Northerners, and that doesn't exactly apply to the Southerners. There were a number of reasons why, but they were fighting one with another. And finally, the South fired on Fort Sumter, which is a big fort on an island just off the coast out there in the east. President Lincoln knew something had to be done. He knew he had to have armies to fight off those Southerners. And he didn't have enough armies. And so he called to the various states in the North at that time to form companies of 100 men or so and send them out east to quell these rebels. And here in Wisconsin, in Manitowoc in particular, they were really excited about that idea because they were proud of their country. Many of the people here were recent immigrants, and they wanted to stand up for their country and keep this country free. And they were willing to fight. And there was a lot of talk here in Manitowoc amongst the men at that time. And finally, somebody at one of the meetings pounded his hand on the desk and says, "Enough of this talk. Let's sign up. Give me a pencil and a piece of paper, and I'm going to sign my name and to volunteer to be in a company to go off and fight those rebels." And so it didn't take long. After 3 days, there were over 100 men, boys mostly, who had signed to volunteer. Only 5 of them were married, and of course one of them was my great-grandfather, who had a little boy, and a wife who was expecting, my great-grandmother expecting another little one. But they were proud to fight for freedom for the North there. They came for freedom and they wanted to fight for freedom, and many other reasons there were too. But they practiced here in Manitowoc. There was a park that was called the North Park, and it became called the Union Park because of the soldiers. And they practiced there to be soldiers, and they elected a captain at that time. That's what they did, not today, but in those days they did. A Captain Temple Clark, because he had a relative who was in an army and had a little training, so he knew a little bit about how to train a soldier. So they elected him captain, and they marched at Union Park, forming lines, and they even marched in downtown. And they looked fine, and they knew that those Southerners didn't have much of an army. It's going to be just a couple months. They would go out east and have an excitement of a little bit of a battle, and they'd come home again. Little did they know. But we women, or the women of the day, knew it was a man's war. In those days, women didn't fight, although there were a few that slipped in, under disguise. Not in Manitowoc. Manitowoc didn't have any girls who did that, but some of the other states did. Anyhow, it was a man's war. And the women in Manitowoc County wanted to do something. What could they do? And a flag. They could make a flag. And so Mrs. Gideon Collins, who was wife of the president of Manitowoc at that time, she headed up some ladies and decided to design a flag, the red, white, and blue, after the national flag. Red and white stripes and the blue Union, that's what it's called back there. That blue part is called the Union. And that was a design. And of course, in Manitowoc in the 1860s, there weren't any stores they could go and buy some beautiful silk. And so a couple of the ladies got together and they took a buggy ride and went to some of the larger towns, all the way to Chicago, really, without much success. You see, people were so patriotic. They were making buntings, draping these pretty swaggers of red, white, and blue on their stores and even some of their homes. And so they had trouble finding white fabric, white silk. They had the red and they had the blue, and no matter how far they went, they could not find white silk. They came back to Manitowoc. Mrs. Collins and some of the ladies came back feeling very badly that they could not follow through making this beautiful flag. But you see, it does have red and white stripes, doesn't it? And let me tell you how that happened. there was a young lady here in Manitowoc who was engaged to one of the young men who was going to go off to war with the rest of the boys. And she said they were going to put off the wedding until after he returned. And she had this beautiful white silk, and she went to Mrs. Collins and she said, Mrs. Collins, you may have my white silk for my wedding gown if you promise never to tell anybody my name. And do you know, today we still don't know who she was. We can only hope and pray that he came back and they were able to be married together. Anyhow, they finally had the white silk, and so the construction had begun. And of course, there were sewing machines in those days. It wasn't all done by hand. But it did take time to make this beautiful flag. And the boys were marching around Union Park, and Captain Clark had heard that the ladies were making a flag. So he knew when he saw some ladies walking up towards them, and somebody had Mrs. Collins had a red, white, and blue, whatever it was, in her hands, must have been the flag. They were all excited, and Captain Clark had his boys stand at attention and form 2 straight lines. And of course there were over 100 of them, so there was quite a show. And then Mrs. Collins and some of her ladies walked through the lines, and she stood by Captain Clark with this beautiful flag, and she gave such a beautiful speech with all her heart. She talked about, with love, these tender hands made this flag so they could carry into battle, knowing that the people at home here in Manitowoc were praying for them and hoping for their success. And they should bring honor and glory to that flag and bring it home, and so we can enjoy together the success of the battles. And so Captain Clark was so moved by what she said, he told the boys how honored he was to receive this beautiful flag, and we ought to give some cheers to these ladies who made this flag. And so 3 cheers, hurrah, for the ladies who made that flag. It was a very moving day for them all. Well, now the boys had a flag to carry around with them. And as they marched at Union Park, and they even marched into Manitowoc too, along some of the streets with that beautiful flag. And it was quite a spectacle. Time finally came, and they were called to go to Camp Randall, Madison, where they could learn more about soldiering. There was a big camp there, and other soldiers' units were gathered there too, so they were on their way. Because in those days there was no railroad here in Manitowoc, they had to take, of course we're on a lake, right? They had to take a boat to Milwaukee. Milwaukee had a train and could take them to Madison. And so when the time came, the day came in 1861, that they gathered down at the pier and met the Comet. It was a paddle wheeler, a steamship that engineered a big paddle wheeler to push the water along. It was called the Comet. And at that time, the boys, over 100 boys, and of course they had this gorgeous flag. And it seemed like all the people in the county gathered together that day to meet those boys and send them off with hurrahs and singing. And actually, there was a young group of boys who had just graduated from high school, and they had a beautiful song that they sang, and patriotism was, it was amazing. It was a beautiful day. And finally they, after many tears and cheers, the flag and the boys pulled away, headed for Milwaukee. Well, there was a young man for whom we are very grateful because he left letters and diaries about the war. That's where we've learned a lot about the war in Manitowoc's connection. And he was a buddy of Thomas Alcott's. We were neighbors for a while, and then the Andersons moved to Manitowoc before we did. Anyhow, the boys still didn't have uniforms. You know, all these hundreds of boys that Lincoln asked for, he didn't have uniforms for the boys. They didn't have guns to shoot. And so when they were marching, some of them might have had a shotgun, or some of them used sticks to look a little bit like soldiers when they were practicing marching. Well, when they got to Milwaukee, Anderson decided he's going to get himself a pistol, so at least he'd have something that he would feel a little bit soldierly about. And from there, the boys mounted a train to take them to Madison. And the whole country, of course, was patriotic. They knew when this train was passing through their small towns that it was headed for Madison, and there was Camp Randall. So when the train slowed down at these small towns, all the excited members of those small towns had baskets and things for the boys, quilts and foods and things for the boys. So there was a lot of excitement going on all the way to Madison. And when they landed there, and several of the companies had gone east already, and so there was a space open for the boys of Manitowoc. And they set up their tents, and the captains had a larger tent. And so in front of this larger tent was a pole with this beautiful flag on it. And they were settling in, knowing they wouldn't be long, and they would get uniforms, and they'd get guns, and they'd go off to battle. And so they were settling in, and a constabulary came by and talked to the captain and said, "Sir, that is a beautiful flag, but you can tell it's homemade, and it's not an official flag. And you cannot carry with you when you go off to the east to go into battle. You cannot take that flag with you, because that's not an official flag. You have to put that flag away or send it home." And the boys were heartbroken because they made those promises to the ladies back home, bringing it into battle with them in glory and bringing it back, and all those wonderful, exciting things they had shared with the ladies couldn't happen. But, you know, they did carry that flag into battle with them, and they did go into battle. And when they did, I'll back up a little bit in a minute, but when they did go into battle, they carried it with them, and you know how. In those days, when the uniforms that were given to the boys, they thought, "Oh, well, you're this size, looks like this would fit you," type of thing. Not really nice fit uniforms like they have today. And so they were a little bit on the loose side, many of them. So it was easy to wrap this beautiful flag around them and take it into battle. So they took that flag into battle with them. But you know, over the period, well, I'm skipping and I'll head back again, I'm sorry. We'll head back to Camp Randall. And you know, when they first got to Camp Randall, it was exciting for them because here was this beautiful camp, and the people from Madison and around would bring food in for the boys, and so the meals of the first couple of days were wonderful. But you know, when there are hundreds of boys and all that food that needed to be refrigerated, how could they do that in those days? Not like today. And as the days went on, it was a month or so went by, the food was not as palatable as it had been in the beginning. And when they're marching through Madison streets, they were dirt streets, and they were dusty, and it was hot summer. And so they were getting kind of discouraged. They didn't have their uniforms yet, and no guns yet, and here they're marching around, but they did have a flag. But they couldn't take that into battle. At least they could march it with it in Madison in the parades. But they figured the 4th of July parade, now that's going to be a fun parade. They're going to really treat us well and treat us a good meal and everything, you know, and the community was all out, and there were lots of flags flying and buntings and all. And when they came back to camp, same old food. And you know, they were pretty disgusted. Here they were willing to give their lives for this country, and they couldn't even be taken care of and fed good food. So do you know what they did? The boys from Manitowoc, who are now Company A, 5th Wisconsin, they are called, they decided they were going to come back to Manitowoc. So they left everything, and they started marching disorganized back to Manitowoc. And they didn't get very far, and some of them said, "What are we doing? We promised to fight for our country. We promised the people back in Manitowoc. What would they feel? What would they feel? How would they feel if we came back, you know, and not fulfilling our promise?" And they stopped, and they thought about it, and they thought, "No, we'd better go back." And they did. And they returned. And it wasn't long before they got their uniforms, so they were starting to feel a little bit more like soldiers. But they didn't have armament yet. Well, it was time to head east, and they did. The first place that they arrived was in Pennsylvania, and there they received their armament. Actually, you know, there were guns that were available from one of the earlier wars, one of the Mexican wars, and they were as dangerous in the front as they were in the back, so they weren't very good guns. But at least they were guns. They felt like they had something should they go to battle. And then they went on to Washington, D.C., and they took that flag with them, but they couldn't show it anymore. It was against the law to do that. So they took it in the valise and took it with them, and they were in a few skirmishes, and then they were in a battle at Williamsburg, and that was a very tough battle. And there were some of the boys in the 5th were injured, even some of them were killed. And Captain Clark felt it's time for him to be transferred. He had another opportunity, so Temple Clark transferred to a different unit. And Horace Walker, who had been fighting with the boys, who had been a higher officer, not as high as Temple Clark, took Temple Clark's place as captain. And he decided this beautiful flag that they would take it under their garments with them into battle. By that time it got a little bloodstained, a little torn. Of course the boys sweated, so there was discoloring and everything, and starting to tear a little bit under their coats. Decided we maybe better send it back home. It's done its duty. And some of the boys were sick, some of them were wounded, and there was a hospital at Savage Station there in Virginia. And that was a good place to send the boys. Captain Walker decided he was going to take the boys to Savage Station and make sure the boys were able to get into the hospital. And he put his the flag into his valise and send it with the boys. There was a train going through the area there over to Savage Station, and he'd send the boys on the train with the police. And by the time they got there, they could probably get their flag home from there, and the boys would get some hospitalization. Well, the train was a lot faster than the boys who marched there, and the train arrived at Savage Station earlier than the Company A did. And those Confederates were good soldiers. They had taken over the town. The town was now in Confederate hands. And so when this train came into the station, the Confederates jumped on that train and took the sick and wounded boys captive. Thomas Alcott was one of them. He had been sick. And they sent the boys over to one of the prisons near Richmond, Virginia. And, you know, if you ever go on a vacation, you like souvenirs, right? You want to have something to remember that wonderful experience. Well, how about a flag? How do you think a Confederate boy thought when he looked in that valise that was there in that train, that there was a Union flag, red, white, and blue? He knew it wasn't Confederate, not made like that. Confederate flags didn't look like that at all. And it said Wisconsin on there. So what a souvenir he had. So this Confederate boy took this souvenir, and who knows what happened to it for a while, because word didn't get around as to what happened to it. But there was a time, not too long a period after that, that the Pennsylvania Bucktails, they were called, were going to go into battle against some Confederates. Well, you know, during the Civil War, sometimes they were only a couple hundred yards away from each other, and they could see each other. And the Pennsylvania Bucktails were called Bucktails because at that time, the boys can't now, but at that time, the boys sometimes in a unit might put something on their uniform that would distinguish them from somebody else. Well, these boys put bucktails in their hats, called the Pennsylvania Bucktails. And should you see a picture in any of your history excursions of Civil War boys with some bucktails in their hats, that's the unit, Pennsylvania Bucktails. And anyhow, here are the Pennsylvania Bucktails facing the Union. They're about to charge the Union, and they saw one of the Confederates had a flag that he was kind of swishing back and forth. And one of the boys in the Pennsylvania Bucktails realized, hey, that's not one of their flags, that's one of our flags, because the red, white, and blue wasn't made for a Confederate flag. So he did something again that you aren't supposed to do. He broke ranks, and he ran across the field there, and he tackled that rebel that had that flag. That rebel with that flag, and he was strong enough that he could get that flag away from that rebel, and the guy was laying flat on the ground, and the Pennsylvania Bucktail ran back to his captain, because they were about to go into battle, so what could he do but give it to his captain, because he was supposed to be a soldier who was going to fight. And so the captain took the flag and sent it to the rear, which they often did. The captain generally had some things in the rear, or his personal things in the rear, and so that's where the flag went. And then they went on to the battle, and then we didn't hear much about it, not for a while. When the war was finally over, Captain Oliphant was his name, from the Pennsylvania Bucktails. He had this flag, he kept the flag, and he had showed the flag to some of his friends and family and told a little bit of the story that he knew about it. But by 1876, over 10 years later, there was an exposition a Philadelphia exposition happening in their state. And what happened at the exposition was each one of the states that cared to put up a big, beautiful building, as Wisconsin did, a big, beautiful building showing the things that they were famous for. Of course, like cheese and machinery, things like that here in Wisconsin, wheat and cows and things like that. And there was a gentleman, W.W. Waldo, his name was. Actually, he's the one that married Thomas Alcott and my great-grandmother, Catherine Sullivan. And he was a dignitary, and he decided he would go off to see this exposition and see the Wisconsin building. And he walked into the building, and he couldn't believe his eyes. Captain Oliphant, feeling it was time that the flag was returned to Wisconsin, decided he would put it in the Wisconsin building at the exposition. And he knew somebody somewhere along the way would know the history of that flag or where that flag belonged. Manitowoc, he didn't even know where Manitowoc was. but there it was. Mr. Waldo saw that flag, and he did what he could to get permission to take it home to where it belonged. And then later he wrote some letters to Captain Oliphant and found the story that I shared with you. And you know, some of the boys, when that flag was captured out there at Savage Station, taken by that rebel, they thought they would never ever see that flag again. The people back home thought, oh, the Confederates had that flag, we'd never see it again. So when Mr. Waldo brought that flag home, there were many tears shed, tears of gratitude, as Catherine did, because her husband didn't come home. He lost his life in 1863 at Fredericksburg. That flag was honored and glorified, and the story was shared, and the boys that were here in Wisconsin shared the story with others, and the beautiful flag was draped over caskets of the boys that passed away from all the units that were in Wisconsin from the Civil War, or in the area, Manitowoc area.